In August 1799, a posse in Webster County, Kentucky, surrounded a notorious outlaw who had terrorized the frontier for 2 years. Micajah Big Harpe lay dying from a gunshot wound. As one of the posse members, a man named Moses Stegall, whose wife and child Harpe had murdered, began to slowly cut off Harpe's head with a knife while he was still conscious. The outlaw's last words were, "You're a goddamned rough butcher, but cut on and be damned." Big Harpe was one half of America's first known serial killers. He and his brother had murdered at least 40 people across Kentucky and Tennessee. They had escaped capture repeatedly, evaded organized posses, broken out of jail, and lived as fugitives in the wilderness for years, all in an era before police forces, before forensic science, before any of the tools we associate with catching dangerous criminals today. So how did 18th century America's most dangerous criminals manage to evade capture for so long? And how were they eventually brought to justice, if they were caught at all? Welcome to the dark underbelly of colonial and early American crime, where the most ruthless outlaws exploited a weak justice system and vast wilderness to become living nightmares. The 18th century created ideal conditions for dangerous criminals to flourish in America. Three factors combined to make this period particularly vulnerable to long-term criminal activity: geography, governance, and social upheaval. Colonial and early American geography favored fugitives in ways that are difficult to imagine today. The eastern seaboard contained pockets of settlement separated by dense wilderness. Beyond the Appalachian Mountains stretched hundreds of thousands of square miles of frontier territory, forests, swamps, mountains, and river systems where a fugitive could disappear for years. Unlike Europe, where centuries of development had created dense populations, extensive road networks, and established towns within days, travel of each other, America offered genuine wilderness. A criminal fleeing from Philadelphia could reach unmapped forests within a few days' journey. Once there, pursuing authorities had no surveillance systems, no way to track movements, and no network of informants. The wilderness was both sanctuary and weapon for those desperate or skilled enough to exploit it. The Great Dismal Swamp between Virginia and North Carolina, covering over 100,000 acres of impenetrable wetland, became legendary as a refuge for fugitives of all kinds. Cave-in Rock on the Ohio River provided natural shelter for river pirates. The Natchez Trace, a 500-mile trail through dense forest connecting Natchez to Nashville, became infamous for bandits who could attack travelers and vanish into the woods within minutes. As explored in previous episodes of this series, 18th century America lacked anything resembling modern law enforcement. Constables, sheriffs, and part-time watchmen operated with minimal training, no standardized procedures, and severely limited resources. A county sheriff might be responsible for hundreds of square miles but have no deputies, no budget for extended pursuits and other duties, tax collection, court administration that took precedence over chasing criminals. Moreover, these officials had no forensic tools, no fingerprinting, no photography, no DNA analysis, no centralized criminal databases. Identification relied entirely on physical descriptions and witness testimony. A criminal who changed clothes, grew a beard, or moved to a different region became effectively invisible. Communication between jurisdictions was slow and informal. A warrant issued in Virginia meant nothing in Pennsylvania. Even when authorities knew a dangerous criminal had fled to a neighboring colony or state, coordinating pursuit required letters carried by riders that might take weeks to arrive, if they arrived at all. The patchwork nature of colonial and early American governance created jurisdictional gaps that sophisticated criminals exploited ruthlessly. Each colony operated under its own legal code, with its own definitions of crimes and punishments. After independence, this fragmentation intensified. 13 separate legal systems with no obligation to cooperate in criminal matters. The Constitution's extradition clause, Article IV, Section 2, theoretically required states to return fugitives, but enforcement was voluntary and slow. A criminal who committed crimes in one state could flee to another and live safely for years before, if ever, extradition proceedings concluded. International borders provided even greater protection. Spanish Florida, French Louisiana, until 1803, and British Canada operated under foreign governments with no extradition treaties. Criminals who reached these territories were essentially beyond reach of American justice. The Revolutionary War, 1775–1783, and its aftermath created social conditions that fostered criminal activity. The war displaced thousands of people, disrupted established communities, and created a population of rootless veterans, some traumatized by years of violence, struggling to reintegrate into civilian life. Economic instability in the 1780s and 1790s drove some desperate people to crime. The frontier attracted not just honest settlers seeking opportunity, but also those fleeing debts, failed farms, or troubled pasts in the East. This population included individuals willing to prey on others. Additionally, the Revolutionary War legitimized violence for political ends. Men who had fought as irregular militia, engaging in guerrilla warfare, ambushes, and raids, sometimes found it difficult to distinguish between wartime violence and criminal violence. Some Revolutionary War veterans, including Samuel Mason, as explored in a previous episode, transitioned from military service to organized crime with alarming ease. Into this environment, vast wilderness, weak law enforcement, jurisdictional chaos, social disruption, emerged criminals who would become legends of American crime. Some were opportunistic thieves who discovered they could live beyond society's reach. Others were psychopaths who found in the frontier's violence and isolation the perfect environment for their darkest impulses. Their stories reveal not just individual criminality, but the fundamental weakness of 18th-century justice systems when confronted with intelligent, ruthless, mobile criminals willing to exploit every advantage the era provided. Micajah Big Harpe and Wiley Little Harpe were not ordinary criminals. They were America's first documented serial killers, and their 7-year reign of terror across Kentucky, Tennessee, and the Mississippi Territory remains one of the most horrifying crime sprees in American history. The Harpe brothers first appeared in Knoxville, Tennessee, in 1797. Born Joshua and William Harper, they had served as loyalists during the Revolutionary War, fighting for the British in brutal, irregular warfare. After the war, they lived on the margins of society, drifting through frontier settlements with 2 women they claimed as wives, Susan and Betsy Roberts. What set the Harpes apart from typical frontier criminals was their apparent motivation. They seemed to kill not for profit but for pleasure. Unlike bandits who robbed and sometimes killed victims who resisted, the Harpes frequently left their victims' possessions untouched. The killing itself appeared to be the goal. The Harpes developed a distinctive method. They would befriend travelers, share campsites or lodging, wait until victims slept, then murder them brutally, often by crushing skulls with tomahawks or stones. They would disembowel corpses, fill body cavities with rocks, and sink them in rivers to prevent discovery. Contemporary accounts describe some of their confirmed murders with stomach-turning detail. A traveler named John Langford was killed, disemboweled, and thrown into the Halston River. A peddler named Peyton was tomahawked, and his body hidden in a hollow tree. A child, accounts vary whether it was their own infant or a victim's child, was murdered because its crying annoyed them. Big Harpe reportedly swung it by its feet and smashed its head against a tree. 2 young men, Trowbridge and Bates, were killed while sleeping at a campsite. A woman named Susan Hale was stripped, raped, killed, and thrown off a cliff. Estimates of their victim count range from 20 to 50 people. The true number will never be known, as bodies were successfully hidden and the frontier's transient population meant disappearances often went unreported. In early 1799, Kentucky authorities finally captured the Harpes and jailed them in Danville, charged with multiple murders. The community believed justice would be served. But the jail, A primitive log structure with a single guard couldn't hold them. On the night before their trial, the Harpes overpowered their jailer, broke out, and fled back into the wilderness with their female companions. For 6 more months, the killing continued. Bodies turned up along trails. Panic spread across Kentucky. Families evacuated isolated cabins. Men traveled in armed groups. The Harpes had become folkloric monsters. Every unexplained disappearance, every murder victim found in the woods was attributed to them, some accurately, some not. They had achieved a kind of mythic status, criminals so ruthless and elusive they seemed almost supernatural. The Harpes' downfall came from their own brutality. In August 1799, they murdered a Kentucky man named Moses Stegall's wife and 4-month-old child. Stegall, driven by grief and rage, organized a relentless posse that tracked the Harpes through the wilderness. Near present-day Webster County, Kentucky, the posse cornered Big Harpe. In the ensuing fight, Harpe was shot multiple times and mortally wounded. What happened next became frontier legend and revealed the depths of rage the Harpes' crimes had inspired. Rather than allowing Harpe to die from his wounds, Moses Stegall allegedly began slowly cutting off his head while he was still conscious. Harpe's reported last words, "You're a god-damned rough butcher, but cut on and be damned," reflected his defiance even in death. Big Harpe's severed head was mounted on a pole at a crossroads as a warning to other outlaws. The location became known as Harpe's Head and remained marked on maps for decades. Wily Little Harpe escaped the posse that killed his brother. He fled south to the Mississippi Territory, where he assumed the alias John Sutton, and joined Samuel Mason's river pirate gang. Mason's story was covered in episode 25 of this series. In 1803, after Mason's capture and escape, Little Harpe and his companion James May offered to track down Mason for the reward. They returned with Mason's severed head, but the identification process went wrong. When Mason's wife couldn't definitively identify the head, authorities became suspicious. Investigation revealed that John Sutton was actually Little Harpe. Both he and May were arrested, tried for murder. Authorities suspected they had killed someone else and claimed it was Mason. Convicted and hanged on February 8, 1804. Like his brother, Little Harpe's severed head was mounted on a pole along the Natchez Trace as a warning. The Harpe brothers evaded capture for years because they exploited every advantage 18th-century America offered criminals. They constantly moved between Kentucky, Tennessee, and beyond, never staying in one area long enough for local law enforcement to organize effectively. They lived in forests and caves, places where pursuing posses couldn't track them. When Kentucky authorities pursued them, they fled to Tennessee. When Tennessee organized against them, they returned to Kentucky. They were willing to kill anyone, men, women, children, even their own infant, which made them extraordinarily dangerous to pursue. On the frontier, strangers were common. The Harpes could appear in a settlement, seem like ordinary travelers, and commit murder before anyone suspected. Their eventual capture resulted not from superior law enforcement, but from a father's grief-driven determination and a posse's relentless pursuit. Tom Quick represents a different category of dangerous 18th-century criminal, the vigilante whose crimes were committed under the guise of frontier justice, making him simultaneously a murderer and a folk hero. Tom Quick was born around 1734 in the Delaware Valley region, present-day Pennsylvania-New York border. In 1756, during the French and Indian War, Lenape, Delaware, Indians allied with the French attacked Quick's family. According to his later accounts, Quick witnessed his father being killed in an ambush. This traumatic experience reportedly transformed Quick into a man obsessed with revenge. He swore an oath to kill 100 Indians to avenge his father's death, and spent the next 4 decades attempting to fulfill this vow. Between approximately 1756 and 1795, Tom Quick killed an estimated 240 Native Americans, men, women, and possibly children. His methods were those of an assassin: ambush, surprise attacks, and murder of unarmed victims. Contemporary accounts describe several of Quick's killings. He allegedly lured a group of Native Americans onto a log over a river, then chopped the log in two, sending them to their deaths. He shot unarmed Native Americans while they slept or fished. He reportedly killed Native Americans who had converted to Christianity and were living peacefully in white settlements. One account claims he murdered a Native American man who was friendly with settlers and had no connection to any violence against whites. Tom Quick was never arrested, never tried, never punished for decades of murder. Why? Because in frontier Pennsylvania and New York, killing Native Americans wasn't considered a crime. It was considered patriotic defense of white settlements. Several factors protected Quick from justice. 18th-century racial ideology viewed Native Americans as savages, whose deaths mattered little to white legal systems. Prosecutors rarely brought charges when victims were Native Americans. Quick was celebrated in white communities as an Indian fighter and defender of settlers. Local populations protected him from any authorities who might have questioned his actions. The frontier regions where Quick operated had weak governance and disputed jurisdiction. Even if authorities wanted to prosecute him, determining which colony or state had jurisdiction over crimes committed in borderlands was difficult. Quick could always claim his killings were preemptive self-defense against hostile Indians, a claim frontier juries would readily accept regardless of evidence. Tom Quick died of natural causes around 1795 or 1796, having never faced legal consequences for his decades of murder. For the next century, he was celebrated in regional folklore as a frontier hero. James Eldridge Quinlan published a biography in 1851 titled Tom Quick, The Indian Slayer and the Pioneers of Minnesink and Wawarsink, which portrayed Quick as a righteous avenger. Only in recent decades have historians begun to re-examine Quick's legacy, recognizing him not as a hero, but as a serial killer whose crimes were excused and even celebrated because of his victims' racial identity. Tom Quick's story illustrates a disturbing reality. In 18th-century America, whether someone was considered a dangerous criminal or a folk hero often depended not on their actions, but on the identity of their victims. A man who killed dozens of people lived as a celebrated member of society because racial ideology and frontier violence made his murders seem acceptable, even admirable, to his white contemporaries. This represents perhaps the most insidious form of getting away with it, not by evading capture, but by committing crimes that the legal and social system refused to recognize as crimes at all. Not all dangerous 18th-century criminals were violent. Stephen Burroughs was a con artist, counterfeiter, and identity thief whose criminal career spanned decades and demonstrates how criminals with intelligence and social skills could evade justice repeatedly. Stephen Burroughs was born in Connecticut in 1765, the son of a Presbyterian minister. He received a good education and possessed natural charisma and intelligence, qualities he would use throughout his life to deceive people. Burroughs's criminal career began in the 1780s and lasted until the 1830s. Over those 5 decades, he impersonated a minister and preached sermons in multiple churches, despite having no ordination, taught school under false credentials, counterfeited currency throughout New England and Canada, escaped from jail at least 3 times, assumed dozens of false identities, wrote and published an autobiography detailing his crimes, which became a bestseller. Burroughs's most sustained criminal activity was counterfeiting. In the 1790s and early 1800s, he operated a sophisticated counterfeiting operation in rural New England and later in Quebec, Canada. He created high-quality fake currency and recruited networks of distributors who would pass the counterfeit notes in distant locations. What made Burroughs particularly dangerous wasn't violence but his ability to corrupt others. He recruited seemingly respectable people, merchants, farmers, even local officials, into his counterfeiting schemes by offering them profits and convincing them the crime was victimless. Burroughs was captured and jailed multiple times but repeatedly escaped. In 1785, he escaped from jail in Massachusetts by overpowering guards. In 1790, he was convicted of counterfeiting and sentenced to 3 years on Castle Island, Boston Harbor, but escaped within a year by convincing guards he was gravely ill and needed transfer to a hospital. In 1806, he was arrested in Montreal but escaped before trial. Each escape was accomplished through social engineering, convincing people he was harmless, or sick, or worthy of sympathy rather than violence. Burroughs evaded long-term justice through several methods. He constantly moved between Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, New York, and Canada, staying ahead of warrants and building new identities in each location. Unlike violent criminals who attracted attention, Burroughs presented as educated, respectable, and charming. He could blend into communities, gain trust, and commit crimes before suspicion arose. Operating across colonial and state boundaries and international borders with Canada made coordinated pursuit nearly impossible. Burroughs' 1798 autobiography, Memoirs of Stephen Burroughs, portrayed him as a roguish but ultimately harmless figure who bucked oppressive authority. The book was a bestseller and created public sympathy that may have influenced authorities to treat him leniently. Because Burroughs didn't murder or rob at gunpoint, he wasn't considered as dangerous as violent criminals. This meant authorities devoted fewer resources to capturing him. Stephen Burroughs spent his final decades in Quebec, Canada, where he lived under an assumed name, operated a legitimate business, and apparently gave up counterfeiting. He died in 1840 at age 75, having spent more time living freely as a criminal than imprisoned. His case demonstrates that the most successful criminals in 18th-century America weren't necessarily the most violent but the most adaptable. Those who could exploit weak law enforcement, jurisdictional gaps, and social trust to commit crimes repeatedly while evading serious consequences. The success of 18th-century America's most dangerous criminals in evading justice had profound effects on how communities understood safety, authority, and social order. The knowledge that brutal criminals like the Harpe Brothers could operate freely for years created a pervasive atmosphere of fear on the frontier. Families abandoned isolated cabins. Travelers moved in armed groups. Strangers were viewed with suspicion. The wilderness, already dangerous from natural hazards, became associated with human predators who might strike at any time. This fear shaped settlement patterns. Communities clustered together rather than spreading across available land. People chose locations with better access to neighbors and authorities, even when more remote locations offered better farmland. The presence of dangerous criminals who couldn't be caught influenced where and how America was settled. Court records and personal correspondence from the late 1700s frequently mention fear of banditti, road agents, and outlaws. This wasn't paranoia. It was realistic assessment of danger in a society that couldn't reliably protect its members from predatory criminals. The repeated failures of official law enforcement to capture dangerous criminals fueled vigilante movements. When the legal system couldn't protect communities, communities took protection into their own hands, often with brutal results. Moses Stegall's slow decapitation of Big Harpe, while the outlaw was still alive, exemplifies this vigilante violence. This wasn't justice. It was revenge and terrorism, making an example so horrifying that other potential criminals would think twice. The mounting of severed heads on poles along roads served the same purpose, graphic warnings that communities would exceed legal norms when pushed. This vigilante culture had costs. While sometimes targeting genuinely dangerous criminals, vigilante groups also made mistakes, executing innocent people, settling personal grudges under the guise of justice, and establishing precedents for mob violence that would continue to plague American society for generations. Tom Quick's case reveals how the danger posed by criminals was often determined not by their actions, but by the identity of their victims. Quick killed dozens of people, but was celebrated as a hero because his victims were Native Americans. This selective enforcement, where some lives mattered and others, was a foundational injustice of 18th-century American society. The same pattern appeared in other contexts. Violence against enslaved people rarely resulted in prosecution. Crimes committed by wealthy white men against poor victims were often ignored. Offenses against marginalized populations simply didn't count as serious crimes in the eyes of many authorities and communities. This selective system allowed many genuinely dangerous people to operate freely, while vulnerable populations had no protection and no recourse when victimized. Dangerous criminals who evaded capture for years often became legendary figures, their stories told and retold with embellishments that transformed them from criminals into folk heroes or monsters, sometimes both. The Harpe Brothers entered folklore as almost supernatural beings, credited with every unsolved murder across hundreds of miles. Stephen Burroughs became a roguish anti-hero through his own autobiography. Tom Quick was celebrated as a frontier defender. These mythologies served psychological functions, making sense of frightening realities, providing cautionary tales, or celebrating individualism and defiance of authority. But they also obscured the genuine human cost of crime, transforming real victims into narrative devices and real criminals into symbols. The manifest failures of 18th-century law enforcement to capture and punish dangerous criminals created political pressure for stronger, more professional systems. The establishment of state police forces, improved communication between jurisdictions, and eventually federal law enforcement agencies all emerged partly in response to the obvious inadequacies of the amateur, localized systems that allowed criminals to operate with relative impunity. The 18th-century criminal crisis, in this sense, was a necessary step toward modern law enforcement, demonstrating so clearly the failures of the old system that reform became politically inevitable. The challenges 18th-century America faced in capturing dangerous criminals, and the methods criminals used to evade justice, resonate surprisingly with modern issues in law enforcement and criminal justice. Just as 18th-century criminals exploited vast wilderness and jurisdictional boundaries to escape pursuit, modern criminals exploit digital spaces and international borders. Cybercriminals operate from countries with weak extradition treaties, committing crimes against victims worldwide while remaining physically beyond reach, functionally similar to Samuel Mason operating from Spanish Louisiana while robbing American travelers. The dark web provides digital wilderness where criminal activity flourishes beyond effective law enforcement reach. Cryptocurrency enables anonymous transactions that parallel the untraceable exchange of stolen goods on the frontier. The fundamental challenge remains: how do authorities pursue criminals who operate in spaces where official jurisdiction doesn't apply or can't be enforced? While modern America has federal law enforcement agencies that didn't exist in the 18th century, jurisdictional complexity still protects some criminals. White-collar crimes often span multiple states, creating disputes about which jurisdiction should prosecute. International criminals exploit differences in laws between countries. The extradition process, while more formalized than in the 1700s, remains slow and politically fraught. Countries routinely refuse to extradite their own citizens or individuals accused of crimes that aren't crimes under their own laws. Russian cybercriminals, Mexican cartel leaders, and international fraudsters often evade American justice because, like Stephen Burroughs fleeing to Canada, they've placed themselves beyond practical reach. The Harpe Brothers' ability to kill repeatedly while moving between jurisdictions previewed a challenge that would plague American law enforcement into the 20th century: the serial killer who crosses state lines. Before the establishment of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit and the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VI-CAP, in the 1980s, serial killers could commit murders in multiple states with minimal risk that authorities would connect the crimes. Ted Bundy, for example, killed women across Washington, Utah, Colorado, and Florida in the 1970s, exploiting jurisdictional fragmentation in ways that would have been familiar to 18th-century criminals. Modern database systems and interstate cooperation have improved this situation, but the fundamental challenge, mobile criminals crossing jurisdictional boundaries, persists. Modern media creates celebrity criminals much as 18th-century folklore created legendary outlaws. Serial killers receive extensive media coverage, have books written about them, and develop fan followings. Drug cartel leaders become subjects of popular television series that glamorize their violence. This modern mythology serves similar functions to 18th-century outlaw legends. It transforms frightening realities into narratives we can process, sometimes heroizes those who defy authority, and often obscures the genuine suffering of victims. The debate about whether extensive media coverage of mass shooters inspires copycat crimes echoes concerns about whether frontier outlaw legends encouraged criminal behavior. When official systems fail to deliver justice, or are perceived as failing, vigilante impulses resurface. Modern social media platforms enable doxing, publishing private information about individuals, online harassment campaigns, and calls for extra-legal punishment of people accused of crimes. The 2013 Boston Marathon bombing investigation saw internet vigilantes incorrectly identify suspects, leading to harassment of innocent people, a modern parallel to frontier posses that sometimes executed the wrong person. The desire to do something, when official channels seem inadequate, is a constant across centuries. Modern America has professionalized law enforcement, developed forensic science, established interstate cooperation mechanisms, and created technologies that make evading capture far more difficult than in the 18th century. Dangerous criminals who might have evaded justice for years in 1799 can be tracked, identified, and apprehended within days or weeks today. Yet the fundamental dynamics persist. Criminals exploit weaknesses in systems. Geographic and jurisdictional boundaries create sanctuaries. Public fear generates pressure for extra-legal responses. And some crimes are taken more seriously than others based on victims' identities. The technology changes, but the patterns endure. The most dangerous criminals of 18th-century America, the Harpe Brothers, Tom Quick, Stephen Burroughs, and many others explored throughout this series, succeeded not because they possessed supernatural abilities, but because they understood and exploited the fundamental weaknesses of the era's justice systems. Vast wilderness provided sanctuary. Weak law enforcement lacked resources and training. Jurisdictional boundaries created safe havens. Communication between authorities was slow or non-existent. Forensic tools didn't exist, and social attitudes meant some crimes and some victims simply weren't taken seriously. The stories of these criminals reveal the dark underbelly of early American society, a world where brutal violence, serial killing, systematic fraud, and racialized murder could continue for years with minimal consequences. But they also reveal something else: the resilience of communities that refuse to accept lawlessness despite institutional failures, the determination of individuals who pursued justice even when official systems failed, and the eventual recognition that fundamental reforms were necessary. Big Harpe's head rotting on a pole at a Kentucky crossroads represented both justice and its failure. Justice, because a brutal serial killer was finally dead. Failure because the system had been so weak that extra-legal violence was required to achieve that result. The heads of Little Harpe, Samuel Mason, and others displayed along the Natchez Trace told the same story: communities responding to inadequate formal justice with informal violence. We've moved far beyond those crude solutions. Modern law enforcement, while imperfect, is vastly more effective than 18th-century constables and sheriffs. Technology, professionalization, interstate cooperation, and scientific methods have made evading capture exponentially more difficult. Yet the fundamental challenges remain. How do we pursue criminals across jurisdictions? How do we balance effective enforcement with individual rights? How do we ensure justice is applied fairly regardless of victim identity? How do we prevent communities from resorting to vigilante violence when official systems seem inadequate? The dangerous criminals of 18th century America got away with their crimes for years, and some literally got away, dying free and unpunished, because the systems meant to stop them were fundamentally inadequate. Understanding why those systems failed and how they eventually improved offers lessons for continuing to strengthen justice today. What do you think? Could criminals like the Harpe Brothers evade capture for years in modern America, or have our systems advanced enough to make such multi-year crime sprees impossible? What modern criminals most closely parallel the 18th century outlaws we've explored? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This concludes our series on crime and justice in early America. If you found these explorations of how communities dealt with crime without modern police forces enlightening, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and check out all 28 episodes in this series. Thank you for joining us on this journey through America's dark but fascinating criminal history.